In recent weeks, a repeated pattern has emerged around Pokrovsk and along nearby approach routes, where Russian nighttime advances are increasingly disrupted before units reach direct ground combat. According to the described developments, formations moving under cover of darkness are often halted during the approach phase, with vehicles disabled and infantry forced to disperse before organized engagement with Ukrainian defensive positions can occur. The disruption frequently takes place at an early stage, when advancing elements still assess themselves as operating outside immediate danger zones. Russian units have been deploying in accordance with contemporary battlefield logic. Movements are conducted after dark, frequently using light vehicles such as civilian cars, small trucks, all-terrain vehicles, and buggies. Forces are divided into smaller elements, and short routes are selected to reduce exposure time before a potential Ukrainian response. The objective of this approach is to compress the window between detection and contact, limit visible mass, and complicate targeting by ground-based observers or traditional artillery spotting methods. However, on the ground around Pokrovsk and in sectors near Zaporizhia, this sequence is increasingly interrupted before completion. Vehicles are disabled prior to reaching intended dismount points, and infantry elements are compelled to leave transport under pressure, often in conditions of lost momentum. Once dispersed, troops face difficulties maintaining organized formations, which restricts their ability to coordinate further movement or sustain a coherent assault plan. As a result, the outcome of many advances appears to be shaped well before frontline tactical decisions can be executed. Early detection has become a decisive factor in shaping nighttime operations in these areas. Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicle units maintain persistent reconnaissance coverage over known approach corridors. Rather than reacting when forces appear near defensive lines, operators identify movement as soon as units depart staging areas. This extended observation window removes the narrow margin of surprise relied upon to close distance quickly and force reactive decisions under pressure. Initiative shifts at the earliest stage of movement, limiting flexibility for advancing forces. Russian adaptations have included reliance on darkness and dispersion. By splitting infantry into smaller groups and reducing vehicle size, planners aim to blend movement into low-visibility conditions and pass through gaps before defensive responses can be coordinated. Yet once UAV surveillance is integrated into the operational environment, these measures lose effectiveness. Ukrainian reconnaissance teams track patterns over time, analyzing timing, direction, and repetition. Movements that appear cautious from ground level become identifiable from the air when multiple elements converge toward the same sector. Able to evaluate direction, speed, spacing, and group size while Russian units remain in transit. This allows commanders to make deliberate decisions instead of reacting to sudden contact near the line. The engagement is influenced during the approach phase, often before the first weapon is launched. Darkness, traditionally considered a protective factor in military maneuver, no longer guarantees concealment in these sectors. Thermal imaging systems carried by reconnaissance UAVs detect heat signatures rather than relying solely on visual contrast. Engines emit sustained thermal output, and human bodies generate consistent warmth. Even when optical visibility is limited, these signatures remain detectable. In such conditions, reduced light does not necessarily slow observation. Instead, it compresses decision-making timelines. Thermal cameras enable operators to maintain awareness regardless of light conditions, including during periods of fog that would historically disrupt line-of-sight targeting. When targets are warmer than surrounding air, thermal contrast remains visible. As a result, environmental factors once viewed as advantageous for infiltration may provide limited protection against aerial surveillance. Units operating under assumptions tied to older battlefield models encounter a surveillance environment defined by persistent aerial presence. Residual heat further complicates attempts at concealment. Roads, vegetation, and soil retain thermal traces after vehicles or personnel pass through. UAV operators comparing frames over time can identify recent activity even after movement ceases. Repeated use of familiar routes during night operations reinforces detectability as patterns accumulate across multiple cycles. This early detection capability feeds directly into response management. Ukrainian operators can distinguish isolated individuals from coordinated groups before contact occurs, enabling proportional decision-making rather than reactive engagement based on incomplete information. Persistence across hours allows separate movements to be connected into broader patterns, reinforcing predictive capacity. In this environment, concealment fails, not necessarily because of a single error, but because repetition itself becomes visible. As a consequence, many Russian advances stall before testing defensive positions directly. Momentum is replaced by hesitation once exposure is suspected. Attempts to slow movement, alter routes, or break formation often generate additional indicators that confirm detection. The approach phase becomes the decisive stage, where surveillance and tracking shape outcomes before direct combat is initiated. The developments around Pokrovsk and nearby sectors illustrate a broader shift in the dynamics of nighttime operations. Control of information, speed of detection, and persistence of aerial surveillance are influencing engagements at their earliest point. In this context, the ability to see first and track continuously is altering how and when confrontations unfold, redefining the meaning of concealment in modern warfare. As vehicle losses mount during the approach phase, engagements shift into a second stage defined by sustained aerial tracking and targeted strikes against exposed infantry. Ukrainian UAV units, after disabling transport platforms, transition from mobility denial to active pursuit. The immediate objective is not solely equipment destruction, but the disruption of cohesion at the moment troops are forced to dismount. When vehicles are stopped under observation, soldiers must make rapid decisions without prepared routes, established cover, or synchronized timing. This abrupt loss of structure weakens local command control before direct ground contact occurs. Without transport, advancing units lose the ability to reposition quickly or select favorable terrain. Movement on foot under aerial surveillance becomes slower and more visible. Options narrow to either dispersal or attempts to reach nearby structures or vegetation. In many documented cases around Pokrovsk and adjacent sectors, infantry elements break into smaller groups, moving toward houses, forest edges, shell craters, or improvised shelters. The intent is to reduce concentration and avoid follow-on strikes by lowering visible mass. However, dispersion generates additional indicators observable from above. Each individual movement produces thermal and visual signatures that reconnaissance drones continue to track. Ukrainian operators often maintain overwatch rather than striking immediately, confirming where troops pause, regroup, or attempt concealment. This measured approach allows strike assets to be directed at positions likely to be occupied rather than abandoned, conserving resources and maintaining pressure. Civilian structures provide limited protection under persistent aerial monitoring. Many frontline buildings are damaged, lacking intact roofs or solid walls. From above, broken entrances and collapsed sections create identifiable access points. Forest edges and tree lines disrupt ground-level visibility, but form predictable lanes when viewed from the air. Repeated use of the same gaps or shelters establishes patterns that UAV operators exploit over time. Snow, mud, and debris further highlight recent activity, preserving traces of movement even after personnel attempt to remain stationary. As isolation increases, logistical constraints intensify. The loss of light vehicles removes not only speed, but also evacuation and resupply capacity. Wounded personnel cannot be moved efficiently, and ammunition redistribution becomes difficult. Minor delays expand into prolonged exposure under observation. Psychological pressure compounds the tactical disadvantage. Troops aware of continuous surveillance often hesitate, alter direction repeatedly, or freeze in place, reinforcing detection cycles. This sequence frequently results in gradual neutralization rather than decisive firefights. Attempts to continue forward without transport rarely achieve momentum. Withdrawal options are limited by open terrain and the same surveillance coverage that disrupted the initial advance. Engagements conclude through attrition during the approach and dispersal phases, rather than through sustained ground clashes. By late January 2026, Russian forces around Liman and Pokrovsk began testing alternative infiltration methods aimed at reducing losses linked to vehicle dependency. Commanders deployed small independent teams with wider spacing, staggered timing, and minimal coordination. The intention was to lower detectable signatures and allow at least some elements to move through perceived surveillance gaps. This method traded speed for survivability, accepting slower progress in exchange for reduced target density. In theory, smaller groups limit the impact of any single strike. In practice, the density of Ukrainian UAV coverage around Liman and Pokrovsk has constrained the effectiveness of this adaptation. Each team must eventually cross open terrain, adjust direction, or pause at identifiable terrain features. Independent operation prevents risk sharing. Each movement must succeed without mutual support. Dividing forces into numerous small elements reduces losses per incident, but multiplies the number of detectable events. Extended timelines further undermine infiltration attempts. Teams moving at different paces stretch operations across longer periods, providing UAV operators additional opportunities to identify patterns and confirm intent. What is intended as stealth becomes a visible sequence when analyzed over time. Detection of one group does not shield others. Instead, it reinforces expectations about route usage and timing. Coordination challenges intensify once a team is identified. Communication delays complicate route changes, and alternative paths often pass through equally exposed terrain. Information obtained by one group may not reach others in time to prevent similar exposure. Terrain features such as forests or damaged villages offer ground-level concealment that create predictable stopping points when viewed from above. Repeated reliance on the same shelters increases vulnerability. Consequently, many small unit infiltration efforts fail before reaching positions where they could link up or conduct meaningful actions. Losses occur incrementally but consistently. Over time, dispersion spreads attrition across more teams without restoring freedom of movement. The cumulative effect is a steady erosion of initiative. Parallel to these tactical adjustments, Ukrainian UAV operations have accelerated their engagement cycle. The process from detection to strike is frequently completed within minutes. Movement is identified, coordinates are transmitted, intent is assessed, and first-person view drones are launched with minimal delay. This compressed timeline reduces opportunities for advancing forces to alter routes or disengage. Pauses intended for reassessment occur under continued observation, limiting effective reaction. Standardized coordination between reconnaissance platforms, command nodes, and strike teams sustains tempo. Clear role separation enables rapid execution without extended approval chains. Repetition across sectors reinforces procedural consistency, allowing similar responses under varying terrain or weather conditions. For advancing units, the shortened reaction window removes practical options. Halting freezes troops in exposed positions, while pressing forward risks immediate engagement. Dependence on light vehicles has amplified vulnerability. Trucks, civilian cars, ATVs, and buggies facilitate rapid crossing of exposed ground, but offer minimal protection and concentrate personnel. A single strike can immobilize multiple soldiers simultaneously. Once disabled, infantry loses flexibility and must operate on foot under surveillance. Repeated vehicle losses compel slower operations and route reuse, increasing predictability. Ukrainian UAV teams have adapted to technical constraints as well. Even when signal disruption occurs near impact, pre-locked trajectories allow many attacks to complete. Fog and reduced visibility have limited effect when targets are confirmed and flight paths established. Mobility denial thus functions as a force multiplier, with one disabled vehicle disrupting an entire movement sequence. Across sectors near Pokrovsk, Lyman, and Pokrovsk, these dynamics are shaping engagements before traditional ground combat develops. Attempts to adapt through dispersion or altered timing have yet to restore sustained momentum. Instead, detection, tracking, and rapid response continue to define the operational environment. The cumulative impact of persistent aerial surveillance and rapid strike cycles has reshaped operational dynamics around Pokrovsk and adjacent sectors, including areas near Lyman and Pokrovsk. Control of low-altitude airspace by Ukrainian UAV units has altered the sequence of events that traditionally precede ground combat. Assembly, movement, and small-scale assault preparations are increasingly subjected to continuous observation, reducing the likelihood that units can concentrate force without detection. As a result, many engagements are concluded during the approach phase, producing attrition without extended firefights. This shift reflects a broader structural change in how battlefield initiative is determined. The capacity to detect movement early, track it across time, and convert information into action within minutes has diminished the tactical value of darkness, dispersion, and light transport mobility. Units unable to move without exposure face shrinking windows in which to maneuver, forcing operational planning to prioritize loss avoidance over territorial gain. The balance between momentum and survivability has tilted toward caution, particularly in sectors where UAV density remains high. Repeated vehicle losses have had secondary consequences beyond immediate casualties. Light platforms such as civilian cars, small trucks, ATVs, and buggies were introduced to offset constraints on armored vehicle availability and maintenance capacity. While easier to replace, these vehicles provide limited protection and concentrate personnel in vulnerable configurations. Their destruction not only halts individual advances but also disrupts broader logistical patterns. Reduced transport availability slows troop rotation, complicates resupply, and constrains casualty evacuation, increasing strain on frontline units even in the absence of direct ground clashes. Operational predictability has also increased over time. Disrupted attempt contributes to a larger disrupted attempt, contributes to a larger pattern library, allowing surveillance to anticipate likely approaches. This dynamic transforms adaptation into repetition, narrowing tactical options. When alternative routes lead through similarly exposed terrain, dispersion no longer guarantees concealment, but instead multiplies exposure points. Psychological effects accompany these structural constraints. Persistent observation imposes continuous uncertainty on advancing troops. Awareness of surveillance can alter behavior, leading to hesitation, abrupt route changes, or extended pauses. Such reactions, while intended to reduce risk, often generate additional indicators detectable from the air. Over time, the expectation of rapid response shapes decision-making at lower command levels, reinforcing a reactive posture. Engagements begin with the assumption of detection rather than the possibility of surprise. In this environment, tempo becomes a decisive factor. Ukrainian UAV operations rely on a standardized loop that integrates reconnaissance, command validation, and FPV strike execution. The compression of this cycle into minutes limits the capacity of opposing units to regain initiative once movement is identified. Time, previously used to adjust spacing or redirect columns, functions instead as an accelerant of vulnerability. Each minute under observation increases the probability of coordinated response. Environmental conditions that once influenced tactical planning have diminished impact. Fog and reduced light offer limited interference to thermal detection when targets present sufficient contrast. Residual heat on terrain surfaces extends visibility beyond immediate movement, enabling frame-to-frame comparison. These factors reduce the effectiveness of infiltration methods dependent on concealment through darkness or weather. Units operating under assumptions tied to earlier phases of the conflict confront a surveillance architecture designed for persistence. Attempts to counter this architecture through small independent teams have not reversed the trend. While reducing target density lowers losses per strike, it expands the number of separate movements required to achieve objectives. Each team must independently navigate open ground and identifiable terrain features. Independent timing extends operational windows, granting surveillance additional opportunities to confirm intent. Gradual neutralization replaces decisive confrontation, spreading attrition across extended periods. The broader operational consequence is a redefinition of what constitutes engagement success. Traditional measures centered on territorial capture or sustained firefight outcomes are supplemented by metrics of disruption and delay. Preventing concentration, immobilizing transport, and forcing repeated aborts alter campaign trajectories without dramatic battlefield shifts. Around Pokrovsk and neighboring sectors, the pattern suggests that information dominance at low altitude exerts influence disproportionate to the scale of individual strikes. This transformation underscores the role of technology integration and procedural standardization. UAV units operate within defined coordination frameworks that separate detection, validation, and execution. Such structure minimizes friction and maintains tempo across varying terrain and weather. For opposing forces, countermeasures such as route alteration or reduced engine use mitigate signature intensity but do not eliminate detectability under continuous observation. As the operational rhythm stabilizes, both sides adjust expectations. For advancing units, planning cycles increasingly incorporate assumptions of early detection and limited reaction time. For defending forces, sustained surveillance becomes the foundation of area control. The interplay between mobility denial, thermal tracking, and rapid strike deployment defines the immediate tactical landscape. The developments observed in recent weeks indicate that many engagements now conclude before conventional ground battles begin.